Here is another example developed by a group of 9th and 10th grade teachers about writing an analytical paragraph based on a text. Shown here is their first draft rubric. They created the following 2 practices: writing and selecting a quote and analysis of that quote. Let's first take a moment to read through the levels for the 2 practices. The first practice reads, I did not complete enough of the assignment to assess. I added a quote. I added a direct quote with no explanation. I did integrate a quote in my own sentence. I did integrate the quote in my own sentence with TLQ. I did not utilize MLA citations, and I did integrate the quote in my own sentence with TLQ, transition lead-in quote. I utilized MLA. For the second practice, not enough evidence was, I did not complete enough of the assignment to assess. I did paraphrase the quote in my own words. I did paraphrase the quote in my own words and discuss the literary element. I did paraphrase the quote in my own words, discussing the literary element and the author's purpose. Advanced is, I did paraphrase the quote in my own words. I discussed the literary element and the author's purpose and made inferences interpreting the material. And expert says, I did paraphrase the quote in my own words. I discussed the literary element and the author's purpose, made inferences interpreting the material, and connected my analysis back to the main idea. Do you hear all that repetition? Let's address that first. Once a particular skill has been achieved, there's no need to repeat it. So in the proficient level, for example, the student would integrate the quote in my own sentence, so it can be eliminated in advanced and in expert. Since using MLA is only expert, you don't need to specify that it's not there for advanced. That only leaves with TLQ for advanced, so let's flesh that out as I incorporated a TLQ, transition lead-in quote. Since we handle TLQ in advanced, that could be omitted from expert, leaving the distinction as I utilized MLA. Let's repeat that for the second practice. Since paraphrase the quote in my own words is beginning level, then it could be omitted from developing. Since discussing the literary element is in developing, then it can be omitted from proficient, along with the paraphrasing. Since discussing the author's purpose is in proficient level, then it can be omitted from advanced. Since making inferences interpreting the materials is in advanced, then it can be omitted from expert. This streamlines the rubric overall and reinforces the skill building framework, resulting in I did not complete enough of the assignment to assess. I did paraphrase the quote in my own words. I discussed the literary element. I discussed the author's purpose. I made inferences interpreting the material, and I connected my analysis to the main idea. Notice how much cleaner it is, how much easier it is to read and therefore understand and use. To align the levels even more, I would make several changes, starting with not enough evidence. This group used I did not complete enough of the assignment to assess for both of those practices. I would argue that whenever possible, state the absolute minimum needed. This will help identify the first things students must do. It's often the negative of beginning and is one of the few times you may want to have a negative. In the first practice, beginning was I included a quote, and developing was I included a direct quote with no explanation. Maybe because I'm not a subject matter expert, I don't see a distinction. So let's move that. I included a direct quote with no explanation back to beginning. Since the beginning level specifies no explanation, that means that there must be an explanation in developing. I add that positive wording to developing, and then eliminate the negative no explanation from beginning, since we usually want to specify what the students can do. Here's the next thing I would ask. Is it necessary to separate these 2 practices? If you don't include a quote, you can't analyze it. Therefore, having a quote is a prerequisite for analyzing it. This is a great example of dependency. And I encourage you to critically examine your practices in this way, because the more practices you have, the more stuff you have to track. Let's combine the two practices into one to see if it works. So, in addition to the direct quote, the integration and the explanation, the teachers will want to see paraphrasing. That should go after including the quote with an explanation, in my opinion, and an attempt at analysis. The way that I define proficient level, the analysis wouldn't have to be correct or complete, just about the correct things. In the original rubric, they had each analysis item, literary element, author's purpose, etc., as a different level. But what if the student does a fantastic job connecting back to the main idea, which is expert, but does not discuss the literary element, which is developing? That would leave them at beginning. That just doesn't seem right to me. I like to leave myself some wiggle room. I don't want to tie my own hands unless I think these 4 analysis types are indeed dependent on each other. But I think that a student can do a deep dive into any one of them to show his or her understanding. I'd be happy to be convinced otherwise, but my position is to keep things flexible for myself and for the students. At the advanced level, the analysis should also be correct. As always, the teacher can specify which one or ones must be included in the assignment description. And this allows you to have the expectation that at the expert level, students can increase their level of complexity, integrating multiple types of analysis correctly. So here's our revised rubric. Let's use it to score some student work. In a moment, please pause the video to give yourself time to read the student's passage. Then restart the video to join me in using the rubric to assess the submission. Here's how I use the learning progression to evaluate the work. Even though, like me, you may not be an English teacher, what do you think the student has earned? I start at the beginning. Yes, the student added a direct quote. Okay, so they've earned at least beginning. Next, check to see if they've met the criteria for developing. Did the student integrate a quote in their own sentence? No, it doesn't seem to be integrated, nor is there any explanation about why that quote is included. And now you can stop because they've missed a piece of criteria for a particular level, so they revert back to beginning. That's what they've earned. I would want to meet with that student to talk about next steps. In this case, I might encourage the student to add an explanation about the meaning of the quote that they selected. Here's another example from another student. In a moment, please pause the video to give yourself time to read the passage. Then restart the video to join me in using the rubric to assess the submission. Here's how I use the learning progression to evaluate the work. I start at beginning. Yes, the student added a direct quote. Okay, so they've earned at least beginning. There's your low floor. Next, check to see if they've met the criteria for developing. Did the student integrate the quote in their own sentence? Yes, because it begins with, after the death, George tells Lenny. There's also an explanation about why that quote is included. So they've earned at least developing. Proficient has 2 criteria, paraphrasing the quote in their own words and analyzing the quote by doing one of those 4 types of analysis. This student did paraphrase the quote in his or her own words by saying, one can see the conflict George is having. He wants Lenny to know he's not mad at him no matter what happens. He or she also clearly analyzed the quote by making inferences, interpreting the material, but doesn't do any of the other types of analysis. Since that piece of analysis also seems correct to me, the student would earn advanced. The student cannot earn expert because while they seem to use MLA formatting for the quote, they didn't use multiple analysis types. Therefore, the student earned advanced. You see how that works? Now, take some time to critique your learning progression, incorporating what we just discussed. Being critical now will make your job easier later. Remember, you have to be able to use this easily, flexibly, and quickly. In addition, you want students to be able to understand and grow from the feedback you give them. In the next module, we will look at some more examples, and then you will create a second learning progression.